Hello everybody, I am Jarrett Ross, a Genie Vlogger, and welcome back to another Professional Genealogist Reacts. On today's video, I will be reacting to I took 10 DNA tests and compared them all. Which one should you take by UsefulCharts? Now, this is the second UsefulCharts DNA testing video. Now, I know he only took 5 DNA tests in this video because he consulted me before doing the video. And I've already done a reaction to the first video he did doing the main 5. So I'm super excited for this one, especially because he tested with a lot of companies that people do ask me about and ask me to test with, but I know they don't really have anything for Ancestry and Genealogy. It's mostly health traits and stuff like that, and that really isn't of interest to me. It'll especially be really fun for me to watch this because I spent the last few months focused on building out his family tree and really researching things in depth. So I really have a good understanding of his tree. So it'll be kind of fun also to see how those percentages line up with what I've found. That's all I'm gonna say for now, but before we do jump into the video, please be sure to give this a like. That really does help me out. Also, be sure to subscribe and click that bell for notifications on future videos. With all of that fun stuff said, let's jump right in.
Hi, this is Matt Baker. Last year, I made a video in which I reviewed 5 different DNA tests, all of which I tried out on myself. Well, this year, I decided to take 5 more tests. So the new ones, which I'll be reviewing in this video, are Cri Genetics, Living DNA, Nebula Genomics, Helix, and Tell Me Gen. These 5...
Now, I will say out of these 5, the only 3 that I have any real direct experience with are Living DNA, Nebula, and Helix. Helix is very tangential, mostly from my experience with the Nat Geo project. The one I'm most experienced with is Nebula Genomics, which I actually have a whole video where I go through my Nebula Genomics test, which is whole genome sequencing. And then for Living DNA, I haven't tested through them, but I've uploaded to their system because they are one of the databases that allows uploading. So if you haven't uploaded there, definitely look into that too. Cri Genetics is one that I get asked about all the time. People ask me if I do a test review of it, if I've taken it, what I know. And the honest answer is that most of what I know is that they don't cater really to any sort of ancestry stuff in any genealogically useful way. And really, that's the main focus of my channel. While I talk a lot about DNA testing, it isn't really like a general DNA testing. It's more of DNA testing for genetic genealogy purposes. And then Tell Me Gen, I'm honestly don't really know that much at all about. I think I've only heard it a couple of times. So let's continue.
5 are not as well known, so I was interested to see how they compared to the big 4. One of the main reasons why people want to take a DNA test is to learn something about their genealogy. So all 4 of the main companies give you an approximate breakdown of where your ancestors likely came from, as well as matches to other users who are closely related to you. Currently, Ancestry has the largest database with around 20 million users, followed by 23andMe with 12 million and MyHeritage with 5 million. Generally speaking, Ancestry and 23andMe are more geared toward the US market, whereas MyHeritage is more geared toward the European market. Now,
I'd say MyHeritage is kind of geared towards both. It's more of that they have more connection with the European market, most significantly in the fact that they have a lot of distribution centers in different areas of Europe, and it makes it so it's one of the easiest tests to obtain in more areas. So for me, I have a lot of family tracing back to Ukraine, and I notice on MyHeritage, that's the place where I get the most matches of people still living in Ukraine, although I still do find that on some of the other sites too.
Of the 4 big testing companies, only 23andMe includes this information as part of the base price. You can also get it from Family Tree DNA, but you have to pay extra for it, which, if you really want to dig deep, might be worth it, because Family Tree DNA really excels when it comes to mitochondrial and Y chromosome DNA.
The main reason for that being Family Tree DNA's mitochondrial and Y testing results are very different from 23andMe. 23andMe does enough testing to give you a basic mitochondrial haplogroup and a basic paternal haplogroup, but on family tree DNA, you get more in-depth haplogroups as well as genetic matching. So 23andMe, sure, you'll get your haplogroups, but you test your family tree DNA and you're going to get actual Y chromosome DNA matches and mitochondrial DNA matches. So you literally know how you're related to these people. You just don't know how far back, because you literally know if you take a Y-DNA test, your matches, you trace up your father's line and their father's line, father, 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 and so on. Eventually, you're going to find that common ancestor. And then it's the same thing for mitochondrial. If you have a mitochondrial match, you trace up your mother's purely maternal line, their mother's purely maternal line, and eventually you will find that common maternal ancestor. So that's really what Matt's meaning when he says that you want to get more in depth. And depending on what type of testing you do, you might also be able to add your information into what's known as phylogenetic family trees, which are basically world family trees based on either the Y chromosome or mitochondrial DNA.
Okay, so let's now move on to the 5 new tests that I tried recently. I'm going to cover Nebula DNA first, because they stand out as being quite different.
Yeah.
This is because they are one of the very few companies that offer whole genome sequencing. Most DNA companies don't actually test every single line of your DNA. Instead, they focus on certain areas that they've deemed important for distinguishing your ethnicity or for determining certain traits. However, if you're willing to pay about $1,000, Nebula will sequence your entire genome based on a simple swab test. This is particularly useful if you want to dive really deep into specific genes related to certain potential health problems. So, if you sign up for whole genome sequencing, the resulting library of personalized reports ends up being pretty big, and there's new stuff being added all the time. At the moment, it has found 284 reports for me. One of the most recent being based on a 2021 study about gallstones. The main result is shown here. It indicates that I have about an average predisposition to getting gallstones. And if I click on View Full Report, I can find out why. Here it shows me the names of the actual genes used in the study, as well as the variants of those genes that I myself have.
So when he says the name of that gene, the name is really just a code, which is kind of like, I guess not really longitude, latitude, but in a sense it's that. It's a code of telling you where in the genome it is. So whenever you see that big crazy combination of letters that's like here RS7802555, that's just basically like a mapping location of this specific marker on this specific spot. Let's continue.
Green puts me at higher risk, whereas blue puts me at lower risk. So you can see that I've got a bit of both, which is why I ended up in the average category. Once again, let me remind you that DNA tests cannot tell you for sure whether or not you are going to get a certain disease or have a certain trait. This is because there are usually many factors involved beyond just DNA, such as your environment and personal choices. So for example, Nebula also found that I have a very high genetic predisposition to insomnia. However, this is not something that I've ever had a problem with. Okay, next up.
Yeah, I should mention right after all of that none of these tests really should be used in any sort of diagnostic or medical way. At best, if you really are using these to get an idea of, are you predisposed to possibly having these things, if you do find that, there is an indication on there and you really want to learn more, you need to go to an actual geneticist, medical geneticist, or go to your doctor and basically talk about actual DNA medical testing, which is available so that you can actually be properly diagnosed if you are disposed to something. So while these certainly can be useful medically for a lot of people, you still need to understand that this is not a medical or diagnostic tool. It's more of just kind of a fun thing, which can hint towards stuff that you should look further into. but let's continue.
Is Cri Genetics, which also uses the swab method. And like most of these tests, costs around $100. This one is quite similar to the Big Four in that it gives you a detailed breakdown of your various ethnicities. So in my case, it predicted that I am about 45% German. However, one thing that
So let's see, 45.2% German, 14.9% Scandinavian, 9.9% French, 9.7% Polish, 9.4% Spanish, 8.4% English, 2.5% Italian, which is all actually really interesting having just done his family tree, because I definitely did not find any sort of Spanish or Iberian connection in his family. The German certainly makes sense, especially with the Scandinavian and French. Polish you can kind of throw in there too, you know, Poland, Germany, a lot of mixture going on in there, of course, and then English and Italian. So Spanish is the one thing that's kind of like, that doesn't quite fit what I know of his family tree. But of course, maybe there's something they're picking up on that all these other tests haven't. But my understanding is this is the only genealogical connected tool they have. There's no actual genetic matching. And for anyone who watches my videos, you all know that I really don't put that much emphasis on these admixtures, especially for genealogy stuff, because it's just a very vague estimate. So, you know, it can be helpful genealogically, but it's not super helpful.
Cri Genetics does not do is give you any relative matches. So if you're looking to find relatives, Cri Genetics is not the best choice.
And the main reason why I haven't tested with them.
However, if you mostly just want to learn about yourself, Cri Genetics does give you a bunch of extra trait information as part of their base price. Let's now look at living DNA. Again, it uses the swab method. It costs around $100, and it gives you a breakdown of where your recent ancestors likely came from. But what's different about living DNA is that it is able to give you more detailed information about British ancestry. This is because living DNA is based in the UK. So you can see here that it has predicted that I am 62% British and Irish, which is quite a bit different from what Cri Genetics predicted.
And for anyone who's Jewish, living DNA does not have Jewish readings in their results. And then another thing to note is that I've actually never really heard about how accurate these readings are, because as you can see, they are much more specific than most companies, which some will lump Irish, Scottish, Welsh together. Some of them might break up the countries a little bit, but still lump a few of them together. But none of them break it down to this point, except when it comes to their communities type of stuff.
I want to point out that Living DNA is the only company that can break down British ancestry into specific regions. For example, it has predicted that 17.5% of my DNA originated in southeast England, but only 1.4% from North Wales. So if you happen to be from the UK or have a lot of British ancestors, Living DNA might be a good option for you. And please note that Living DNA does also provide you with relative matches as well. So for me, it found one first cousin and several second or third cousins. The fourth new test that I took was Helix. Now, the reason why I chose this one is that it used to be one of the major options when DNA kits first came out. It was the company that partnered with National Geographic as part of the Genographic project. Sadly, this project shut down in 2020. However, I was curious as to whether or not Helix still offered anything remotely similar to what it did back when it was partnered with National Geographic. Unfortunately, it does not. All I got was an extremely simple breakdown of my ancestry and a few trait-related results. In fact, when I went back to double-check the price of the kit, I couldn't even figure out how to order one anymore. So perhaps I was one of the last to try this option. Which brings me to the final test I tried. Tell Me Gen. I had never actually heard of this one, but it popped up on Amazon, so I thought I'd give it a try. Based in Spain, they are priced
Okay.
about the same as the others and use the spit method. As usual, you get an ethnicity breakdown, and in this case, they also give you your mitochondrial and Y chromosome results at no extra charge. They do offer relative matches, but their database appears to be so small that I didn't even get a single result. So I've now taken 10 different DNA tests. Which one should you take? Well, let me update the flowchart that I presented last time.
Okay.
It all depends on your reasons for taking a test. If you're primarily concerned with building your family tree, I'd still recommend either Ancestry or MyHeritage. Probably Ancestry if you're from the US or Canada, and MyHeritage if you're from Europe. Although
A lot of people will say Ancestry because you can upload it to MyHeritage, whereas you cannot upload MyHeritage to Ancestry. Now, honestly, you can't upload anything to Ancestry. You can upload MyHeritage to GEDmatch and Living DNA and Family Tree DNA and some others, but Ancestry, 23andMe do not allow uploads.
Though, like I mentioned last time, if you're Jewish from anywhere in the world, you might want to go with MyHeritage, as they are a bit better when it comes to Jewish genealogy.
Now, that kind of does vary in some ways. In Ancestry, you have the much larger database, so you do technically do a lot better when it comes to your matches. And Ancestry also has what's known as the Timber algorithm, which kind of cuts out some of the issues caused by endogamy. Endogamy being when a population group only marries within that same population group for many generations, and it makes it so that a lot of people that descend from that are related in multiple ways, which causes all sorts of issues with DNA matching, but that's what Ancestry's Timber algorithm really helps with, is kind of cutting some of that stuff out. With MyHeritage, the big upside is that their ethnicity admixture has more nuance when it comes to reading Jewish percentages. The only issue is they don't release a white paper, so there's kind of a little bit of mystery behind what they're using as the reference, how accurate it's coming out, what are the statistical probabilities like recall and precision associated with the different population groups. And I know that I hear from a good amount of people that sometimes MyHeritage, when it comes to their admixtures, aren't really as strong as other companies. But even with that all said, MyHeritage is a great company to DNA test with, most especially because when you do their genetic match comparison, basically you have a genetic match and you look at the match to see and try to figure out how you're related. They give you some of the best breakdowns. They show you shared matches in common, but even more, they show you how much your match matches those other shared matches. So that gives you a little bit more idea of how you might actually be related. There's a whole lot of stuff with it that's really good. So yeah, their admixture on MyHeritage, maybe not as great, but amazing when it comes to comparison. So I see where he's coming from with what he's saying with that.
Cri Genetics and TellMeGen are good for getting some free trait-based information, but since they don't provide relative matching, my opinion is that it's better to stick with Ancestry or MyHeritage. However, if
Agreed.
it's primarily
Agreed.
health-related information you're after, I do recommend Nebula if you can afford it.
Yeah.
Although Circle has a more user-friendly interface, Nebula felt more solid and scientific to me, so I'm going to give them...
Nebula is super scientific and super in-depth. And while I said before the whole thing about, these aren't medical tests, these aren't diagnostic tests, Nebula is probably the closest to it. But I definitely agree Nebula would probably be the best one to go for with the health stuff.
The edge when it comes to the health category. However, if you're on a budget and or want both ancestry information and health information, I'd recommend 23andMe.
Yeah.
Finally, if you have a specific interest in researching your mitochondrial or Y chromosome ancestors, I'd say that family tree DNA is hands down the way to go.
Yeah.
Okay, now before I go, there are 3 general things that I want to discuss. These are privacy concerns, accuracy, and non-European heritage. Let's start with privacy. I was surprised by the amount of comments on my previous video
All the
that claimed
time.
that most
All
DNA
the
companies
time.
are just fronts for
I mean, all of my videos are about, or almost all my videos are about DNA. So I get so many comments like this about, people being legitimately scared all the way to full on crazy conspiracy. I'm kind of glad he's addressing this.
or the Chinese government or the FBI. And that if you hand over your precious DNA to them, they are either going to create clones of you or arrest your Uncle Bob for that murder he committed. Well, first of all, keep in mind that if someone really wanted your DNA, it's not actually that hard to get. We leave little bits of our DNA everywhere we go. So if someone really wanted to steal your DNA for some nefarious reason, they wouldn't need to use a DNA testing company to get it. And as for Uncle Bob, if he really did murder someone, then I actually hope he does get arrested. But
I agree with you, Matt.
All joking aside, privacy is an important point to consider. Let me summarize what you'll find in the privacy policies of the 4 big companies. First, they will not share your personal information with third parties. In some cases, generalized data that is randomized and anonymized might be shared for research purposes, but this information will never have your name attached to it. And in some cases, you can even opt out of this. So rest assured that no marketing company is going to target you with specific ads based on your DNA results. Second, in the United States at least, no insurance company can force you to reveal your DNA results or deny you health insurance based on your results. This is because of the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act of 2008. Third, with the exception of family tree DNA, your results will not automatically be shared with law enforcement. As with most things, the police would have to get a warrant if they wanted to access such a thing. And even if they did, what they would be given would not be any different from what your relatives are already allowed to see on the website. Fourth, you can even opt out of relative matching if you just want to see your results, but you don't want any potential relatives to be able to find you or see your information. Finally, at any point, you also have the option of requesting the company to delete your data entirely and even to destroy your sample. So, generally speaking, DNA testing is pretty safe. However, keep in mind that terms of service can change and companies can be sold. So if privacy is something that you're concerned about, do your research and keep up with any changes to privacy policies.
Now, a few things to say about what he's mentioned. Biggest one being your results will not automatically be shared with law enforcement. Yeah, there have been subpoenas submitted for information, and I'm pretty sure all the companies have some sort of page somewhere which talk about these, but I'm almost 100% sure, I might be wrong though, that there hasn't been a single subpoena submitted where they actually had to submit the information, the data. But what he said, when law enforcement does access these databases, which is only really done through Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch, both of which require the person to opt in, basically, like he said, you have to choose that you want to opt in to law enforcement seeing it. They're not going to see anything different than when you go into GEDmatch and look at your matches, or when you go into Family Tree DNA and look at your matches. So these ideas that the police are going to go and have every single marker of your DNA just isn't true. And I know a lot of these companies also have pages specifically designed to address law enforcement, as well as people who have concerns about our law enforcement accessing the database, what access do they have, etc., etc.
Okay, so what about accuracy? Like I said, I've now taken 10 DNA tests. 7 of those gave detailed breakdowns of my predicted ancestry composition.
Oh, nice.
Let's now put all of the results side by side. Well, you can definitely tell that I'm white, But notice that there's some pretty major disagreement over whether or not my ancestors came primarily from Germany or primarily from Britain and Ireland. Also, some of the tests seem to pick up on a good percentage of DNA from other parts of Europe, but others did not. So, what gives? Well, keep in mind that these ethnicity estimates are just that. They are estimates, or guesses, based on comparing my data to other people's data. And each company uses a different algorithm for figuring things out. So when it comes to very broad categories, the accuracy is going to be very high. Obviously, my ancestors came primarily from Western Europe, not Africa or Asia or even Eastern Europe. But when it comes to distinguishing between, say, Anglo-Saxon ancestry from England and mainland German ancestry, it gets a bit more tricky. After all, these two groups are closely related. So just keep in mind that you should take it all with a grain of salt. Luckily, most sites will update your results every now and then as their database grows. So hopefully your results will get more accurate over time. Which brings...
Okay, I'm going to go back a little bit. One of the things I do want to say about this is kind of a cool chart. I feel like he could have done it a little bit better. Granted, it would have taken a lot more time. But some of the nuances being lost here, because one thing he didn't mention, and one of the reasons why I kind of let it keep going after I paused for a second, was I was hoping he would talk about how he's simplified how they're defining things. So in this, he has German, British or Irish, Scandinavian, French, Spanish or Italian, and then Eastern European. But when it comes to these companies, they're not all defining it in those terms. Some companies might say Germanic Europe. Some companies say French and German. Some companies will do Scottish, Irish, Welsh, have English as its own. Some companies might have just UK by itself. And then even more like what we saw with living DNA, it has even more nuance, but we can see here he just lumped it in as 62% British or Irish. So it definitely gives that view of kind of how there is a difference, especially when you're looking at more of a broader view. But a lot of nuance can be lost, especially in the sense that how one company defines it, well, it may be similar to how another company defines a similar population group. It might not be the same. So like his Scandinavian, I know not all the companies define it as Scandinavian. Some of them will specifically define Sweden and Norway. They'll define Finland. They'll define Denmark. Some of them will lump different ones up together. So definitely a cool chart, but unfortunately there's kind of a lot of nuance lost, especially in the sense of the differences between the sites. I would have preferred if he had gone through each site and instead of saying, German 75%, 30, whatever, it'd literally be 23andMe and then how they define it all in those percentages, and then the next one over how they do it. But the issue is he's going to end up having like 30 or 40 different rows because each one's kind of defining everything just a little bit differently. All right, let's continue.
So hopefully your results will get more accurate over time. Which brings me to the question of non-European heritage. When DNA tests first became available, the vast majority of people who took them were white. And therefore, to this day, most DNA companies are still better at breaking down European ancestry than non-European ancestry.
Yeah. And you can actually get more specific than that. And it's much more defined in Western Europe than it is in Eastern Europe. So European as a whole definitely has much more representation, but there are some non-European areas that have a bit more representation than some actual European areas. But that's when you're getting on a much more finite view of things in a regional sense instead of kind of a continental sense. So in a continental sense, European is definitely by far the most well represented.
However, as more people from non-European descent take these tests, things are slowly improving. For now, if you are a person with primarily non-European heritage and are wondering which test to take, I'd say it's probably best to go with one of the companies that have a large database, such as Ancestry or 23andMe. However, stay tuned to the channel because I hope to delve deeper into this topic in the future. I'll be starting by partnering with my friend Jabari from the channel From Nothing to do a video on which DNA test is best for African Americans.
And this is actually part of an overall collaboration that I'm also doing with Jabari and Matt, where Jabari is going to be a guest on an upcoming season of YouTuber Family Trees. But let's continue watching.
Okay, so thanks for watching.
All right. Well, another great Useful Charts video. I always enjoy Matt's videos. They're really, really insightful. Of course, I especially love this being DNA testing. And it really goes to show how the DNA testing industry is really expanding. All these other companies are coming up, and it's just going to take time before one of these companies has some new big breakthrough, which probably completely change the game, and then it's going to go from, the top 4 to some other one being within the top ones. But I think the biggest standout of this video, that would be the one of the 5 he tested that I would recommend, would be Nebula Genomics, because they have the best test out of the 5 in this video that you can genealogically use. While Matt discussed the health stuff that they do, if you're trying to do in-depth Y-DNA mitochondrial DNA testing, you technically don't have to do it through Family Tree DNA. You can do it through Nebula Genomics. The only issue is they don't actually host a genetic matching database like Family Tree does. So you'd have to take your Nebula Genomics DNA profile and then upload it somewhere else like YFull, and then find out a lot of similar information of what you would find out if you had done the big Y through Family Tree DNA, which is the most expensive DNA test on Family Tree DNA, but you have the cheapest ones for Y-DNA that are, I think, $100 or $109 or whatever it is. But that one's just the Y37, where it's looking at only 37 markers as opposed to hundreds of Y chromosome markers. And as I mentioned, I've actually done Nebula whole genomics testing before, and I did a whole reaction video to my results. So if you'd like to check out that reaction, be sure to check it out right here. And if you enjoy this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. That really does help me out. You can also click right about here if you'd like to subscribe. It is completely free to do so. You can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at GenieVlogger. I'm the Genie Vlogger. See you in my next video.